Namaste to all of you. A very warm welcome to this evening's program. Friends, we have Sri Sushant Sareen ji. I don't think he needs any introduction. He actually came on our webinar last year. He's a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. He was previously a senior fellow at Vivekananda International Foundation, and he was a consultant for Pakistan Project Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. He's published several books regarding Pakistan. Some of them are like Balochistan, Forgotten War, Forsaken People, and then Corridor Calculus, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and China's Comprador Model of Investment in Pakistan. Then a book called Zarb-e-Azab. I don't know how many of you know it, but the so-called war on terror unleashed by the Pakistani army was termed as Zarb-e-Azab. So he wrote a book on Zarb-e-Azab, an evaluation of Pakistan Army's anti-Taliban operations in the North Waziristan. Friends, today he's going to talk about this topic, which is pretty interesting and also very important. We call this as Is Pakistan Imploding? We have multiple opinions on this. There are people who say it is imploding and there's no alternative to it because it is ideologically, it has no identity. Only identity is anti-India. So it can go up to a point and beyond that it has to collapse. Others say that it's probably too late and it will continue to survive as a country, even if it is something like Afghanistan or some other poor country. So there are multiple views on it. There are recent happenings which I'm sure some of you would have followed. The Tehreek-e-Labbaik, Pakistan's movement, which was very violent, and so that kind of a radicalization which is picking up, and then their economy heavily dependent on Chinese and other loan funds. So all these things are probably trying to tell us that it is likely to collapse. So friends, if it collapses, and then we will have a huge spillover into our territory, how do we deal with it? Given these complexities, who else but Sushant ji, who can enlighten us on this? Probably he'll go deeper into this in terms of the internal dynamics of Pakistan, the military establishment, the facade of democracy, the radicalization, and the impact on India. And overall, what does he think in terms of would Pakistan collapse? And if so, how long would it take? Friends, Sushant Sareen ji for you. Sushant ji, as we discussed, 45 minutes for you, and then we'll have a 15-minute Q&A.
Yeah, I just need to, I have another meeting scheduled for 7, so maybe 5-7 minutes I can pull beyond that, but otherwise we'll try and call it off by 7. Okay. So thanks for giving me this opportunity to talk. Look, the short answer to the question, which is the topic of the day, is no. Pakistan is not imploding. There is a slightly longer answer, longer term answer, but I would say slightly longer term, medium term, you can say. And I would say probably not. But then there is a somewhat longer term answer where I think there is a very, there are serious signs and serious problems which could lead to the implosion of Pakistan. Now, of course, none of these timelines are set in stone. The long term could sometimes be as short as 2 years, 5 years. The short term could be slightly longer, but you know that's the way these things are. But like I said, there are very serious problems, and broadly these are economic problems, these are political problems within Pakistan. These are strategic challenges and new strategic alignments and realignments and dimensions that are coming into play that are going to change the scenario inside Pakistan. And then, of course, there are very serious security challenges that Pakistan faces both internally as well as in its immediate neighborhood. Now, it will be the interplay of these broad factors that could lead to a situation where it becomes extremely difficult to manage the country. And Pakistan is not, it's not a simple country. It is a very complex country, perhaps not as complex as India is, but when you measure Pakistan against most other countries of the world, it is a fairly complex country. It has its own challenges, it has its own problems, and none of those are easily solvable. Uh, and the thing is that, and I'm glad, Giriraj, that you touched upon it, that in the event, frankly, I have no love lost for those buggers, but the simple thing is that we need to also think that in the event, not that we can prevent it, not that we should prevent it, uh, and not that we should have that savior complex that every Indian seems to have when it comes to Pakistan, to try and save Pakistan from itself. I don't buy any of that nonsense. But despite that, I think we need to be mindful of, uh, we might want to celebrate the event as and when it happens of Pakistan imploding and collapsing. Uh, but we should be mindful of the impact that will have on our own country. What will we do if that event does unfold? How will we handle the fallout? And we can't say that there will be no fallout. There will be a fallout, because when and we'll see, we are seeing Afghanistan implode, and we'll see the fallout of that on Pakistan, for example. Pakistan has contributed to that, but that's besides the point. Uh, Whenever there is an implosion in any one country, the neighborhood does suffer the blowback of whatever happens in any one country. So frankly, rather than being in a celebratory mood, I think we need to be somewhat somber on this particular issue and think this thing through. But like I said, you can't prevent it. You should not prevent it. You should not lose, shed any tears if it happens, and you should not lose any sleep if it happens. Um, Having set that particular tone, now let me just go on to tell you why I think that the longer term trajectory, it doesn't look very good for Pakistan. And I'll start with the economy first. And if you look at the economy, basically it is becoming an unsustainable economy. It is only sustainable if there is tons and tons of money coming from outside to prop it up. Um, and uh, and just one figure will probably surprise many of you, that since about 2007-8, when Musharraf left 2008, uh, Musharraf in his tenure, although that was almost 10 years, had doubled Pakistan's uh, total debt from about 3 trillion rupees to about 6 trillion rupees. In the next 5 years, between 2008 and 2013, when the People's Party government was in power, the debt doubled again from around 6 odd trillion to about 13 odd trillion. By the time Nawaz Sharif came, again in those 5 years that his party ruled, that is from 2013 to 2018, the debt doubled again in 5 years. So from around 13 trillion rupees, it went up to about 25, 26 trillion rupees. And then if you look at the last almost, it's slightly under 3 years of Imran Khan, all the projections suggest that by the time Imran Khan elections and finishes his 5-year term, the debt would have doubled again. And it would have gone up from around 25, 26 to about 50, maybe even more, 50 trillion, maybe even more, because it's already at about 43 trillion. Some of it fluctuates with the exchange rates, but that is the prediction, or that is the projection, that is the estimation by the time 2023 comes. And this is clearly not a sustainable proposition. Uh, and why this is not sustainable is that if you look at, see, if debt was doubling and growth rate was also doubling at the same rate, growth was also doubling and GDP was also growing at the same rate, things are manageable. Some of you are businessmen, some of you are accountants, um, most of you run households and meet your own bills, and you know what I'm talking about. Although, again, these comparisons should not be extrapolated to the level of a country, but nevertheless, if your income is keeping pace or is outpacing the growth of debt, you're good. But if your income is not rising or is static, but your debt is doubling, then you have a serious bloody problem on your hands. And if you look at the average growth rate of Pakistan from around 2000, you can say about 2007, really, uh, in the last 14 years, if you look at the average growth rate, it would be to the anything between 2.5 to 3%, right? But if you look at the trajectory of the growth of debt, it's growing at about 11 to 12%. I would imagine it'll be that much because if it's growing at about 12%, then it would double every 5 years or so. One of you can do the math, but you can see the difference in that. So that is something please bear in mind. The second thing you need to bear in mind is the fiscal structure of the government of Pakistan. The entire revenue which the federal government of Pakistan earns in 1 year, the entire revenue, and I'm talking about tax plus non-tax revenue and all of that, is accounted for by just two items. Debt servicing and defense wipes out the entire revenue. After that, everything else is on borrowed funds. So you are paying pensions from borrowed funds, you are running civilian government from borrowed funds, you are paying subsidies from borrowed funds. You name it, all your development expenditure is from borrowed funds. Everything is from borrowed funds. Clearly not a sustainable proposition. Now, about 10 years back, 12 years back, you could add a third element to debt and defense, debt servicing and defense. You could add, say, maybe subsidies, you could add civilian government, and then you would say, okay, these three are accounted for by the revenue, everything is else on debt. Why I'm telling you this is because it also explains why debt is rising as fast as it is rising. And this means that your debt servicing will continue to rise, and there are no fresh revenue sources coming in because growth is not keeping pace. Now, with this kind of a structure, you have another problem coming up. In the latest budget in Pakistan, the total expenditure on pensions, just pensions, is more than the amount of money that the government spends on running the civilian government. Let that sink in. Just the pension bill is more than the money which you are spending on running the civilian government. Okay. And this pension bill is apprehended that this is going to grow exponentially over the next couple of years. And I'm forgetting the exact date, but in another few years, the pension bill alone will probably be more than your defense expenditures. Okay. So clearly you are heading towards bankruptcy unless you change the entire structure. And changing this entire structure is easier said than done. Your subsidy bills are increasing because your energy economics is totally screwed up. Okay. And that has been also virtually rising exponentially, what they call the circular debt, which means basically that you're not able to pay for the electricity that is being generated. And that is creating all sorts of other problems which are coming in. So financially, it is very clear that this is a state, this is a government uh, which is not viable. This problem gets further compounded because of the federal structure which they have. So there are 4 provinces, and under the Finance Commission awards, almost 58% of the revenues or the taxes which are collected have to go to the provinces. So the federal government, the central government is left with very little funds anyways. Now, there are some proposals that you don't give it to the provinces, but if you strangulate the provinces, how do the provinces run? Because all other work has to be done by the provinces. And the federal government needs the money to basically either run its own affairs, to pay subsidies and stuff like that. The governments in the provinces need to take care of health, education, all of that. So clearly, that's not an easy thing to do. So that is another problem which they have to contend with. And these are all structural issues now. Add to this that fact that your population is growing by something like anything between 2.4 to 2.8%. Again, an unsustainable proposition. Now, again, Pakistanis are great ones. All chartered accountants in this group should probably learn something from the Pakistanis on how to cook up books. Because whatever little economics I know tells me that, look, if your economy is not growing, but inflation is pretty high, around 10%, 11%, and there is no real redistributive policies that any government has, then it means that, which means that inequality remains high. Then it means that poverty levels would be increasing. But the Pakistanis have consistently shown that their poverty levels have decreased. Okay. Now, I don't know how they do it, but very clearly, if on an average your economy has been growing by 2.5 to 3%, and the last 3 years it has been growing at about 1% or so, and your population growth is 2.4 to 2.8%, then actually your real incomes are coming down. Your per capita income is falling. So now, and yet if the Pakistanis claim that poverty is falling in Pakistan, then, like I said, perhaps Indian chartered accountants need to learn something from how the Pakistanis cook books. But clearly not a sustainable proposition. And there is, and then you can't go in for family planning either through, persuasion or through any kind of other means, because, all sorts of religious and other questions are brought in. You then come to the other problem which they have, that even when they want to ramp up growth, the economy is so dependent on imports that the moment growth starts increasing, the imports skyrocket. Okay. And exports, on the other hand, have been virtually static over the last almost 8-9 years. Virtually static. Hovering between 23, 24 billion dollars, the height, and coming down to about 19 odd billion dollars. So between 19 to 24 billion dollars is what their exports are. But their imports have been this year, again, last year, again, because there was some growth in the economy, their import bill is over $50 billion. They are managing because remittances have increased, but for how long remittances will remain high is an open question. So clearly there's going to be a problem on that count as well. And the moment this cycle continues for an year or two, you come back to that boom and bust cycle, which is common in Pakistan. That you'll have 2 or 3 years of some growth, and suddenly, because of balance of payments crises and other things, the bottom collapses out of the economy. They go back to the IMF. They've already been to the IMF for about 22 times. They'll go back again. So that's the kind of cycle they have been in. Related to this is the problem of mismanagement, because for Pakistanis, debt is often treated as disposable income, right? They don't treat it as a liability, but they treat it as a disposable income that somebody is given you a loan. तो अच्छा है, ऐश करो, उड़ाओ, मजा करो, and then when the time comes to pay back, we'll see. So, which is why uh, when the Saudis and the Emirates asked them that, listen, about 2 years back, we had given you a few $1 billion, which was basically meant for temporary budgetary support. For basically, it was meant for dressing up the balance sheet, okay, the balance sheet of the country. It's the kind of stuff we people used to do in the 90s when somebody had to go to America. You went to a rich friend and you told him, "Yaar, I need to show sufficiency of funds. तो अपने फादर को बोलो कि 5-7 लाख रुपए मेरे अकाउंट में डाल दें, तो मैं बैंक स्टेटमेंट लगा के वीजा ले लूंगा, एंड देन आई विल रिटर्न योर मनी, और फिर अमेरिका में तो जाके मैनेज कर ही लूंगा." So this is what the Pakistani thing is, you know, that the Saudis will give some money, they'll be there to dress up the balance sheet. It was not meant to be used. But when the Saudis asked for that money back, the Pakistanis actually felt offended. That how can you lend us money and then take it back from us? You are Muslim, brother. How can you take the money back from us? So this is a problem also. And their relations with the Arab world or the Middle East are not exactly what they used to be at one point of time. Nevertheless, some assistance has been given to them again. Now, in this entire scenario, the one thing that the Pakistanis latched on to were the Chinese. And for them, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, was supposed to be their coming out party kind of a thing, that this is what is now going to catapult us into a different league altogether. But clearly that was a nonsensical thing, because yes, the Chinese would be investing money. Yes, all sorts of other things would be happening, but none of it meant that this would actually change Pakistan's destiny in a positive way. And some signs of that we are already seeing, because what is happening is that the obligations for some of the projects which have been completed, the payments have already started, and the Pakistanis are falling short on payments. Whether it's on energy projects, whether it's on some of the other projects, they are falling back on the payments. Now, that has kind of, made the Chinese back off a little bit. So they're not investing the money they were investing earlier. And there are some issues, serious issues, which are cropping up in terms of how the Pakistanis are supposed to pay these guys back. Again, this is related to what I was mentioning earlier, the circular debt problems, electricity costs. The Chinese made these projects and are making supernormal profits from it, which the Pakistanis had signed on at one point of time. But now when payment time has come, they are finding that it's going to be a big millstone around their necks. So clearly these power projects are going to be somewhat unaffordable. And in any case, those fancy numbers that the Chinese are going to invest $45 billion, $60 billion. Someone even went to the extent of saying $100 billion will be invested. That was all nonsense. It started in 2013. 8 years later, the amounts which have been invested is something like $23-24 billion. And you can do the math again. It's roughly about $2 billion a year or thereabouts, $2.5 billion at best on an average. And if $2.5 billion a year is going to change Pakistan's destiny, then you know what that destiny is going to be. So clearly, this is not going to be the kind of game changer and destiny changer which everybody was making it out to be. More so because the second phase, which was supposed to make this project somewhat viable, because Chinese industries were supposed to shift, SEZs were supposed to come up, all of that, none of that has really started. And some of the critical projects which would have made the entire corridor economically viable and sustainable. For example, a railway track which had to be laid from a part of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province all the way to Karachi is going to cost about $8 to $9 billion Pakistanis were supposed to give about $1 billion or $2 billion of that money, and they don't have it. So they're trying to renegotiate with the Chinese. There has been no financial closure. And this, until the railway line comes up, the viability of this whole CPEC project, the viability is in any case very dicey. But unless this thing comes up, the viability is even more dicey. So that's as far as this destiny changer project, which would, improve Pakistan's economy, was concerned. So the second phase of the CPEC remains pretty much on paper. At the same time, the Pakistanis have no option but to stick with the Chinese, because that's where the moolah is coming from. Every time they're in trouble, they go to the Chinese. The Chinese give them a little bit of money, helps them tide over things. The Chinese are the largest arms supplier. The Chinese are today the largest trading partners of the Pakistanis. So everything, basically, China is on the path of making the Pakistanis a bit of a client state. Something like what the Americans were in the 50s and 60s. That is the kind of role the Chinese are going to start playing, which basically means that, it's like the Chinese are going to be the super lords out there. The Pakistanis are going to keep sucking up to the Chinese. Now, this is all very well. But at the end of the day, on the strategic plane, I can completely understand the China-Pakistan nexus, but the economics of it is not making any sense to me, at least. But even the economics becomes even more difficult because of what is likely to happen in Afghanistan. Now, we know that Afghanistan is imploding, and its impact will certainly be felt on Pakistan in one way or another. I think the Pakistanis are playing a kind of a double game. They are actually trying to convince everybody that there will be a massive fallout on Pakistan. But I'm sure that the generals, even though they are saying this, are pretty confident that they'll be able to handle it. I don't think they'll be able to handle it. I think there will be a fallout. But the generals seem to encourage people thinking that there will be a fallout, because they think Pakistan is too dangerous to fail. So the world will have to come to Pakistan's aid. The West, whether it likes it or not, will come to Pakistan's assistance. So, it's the kind of mind games and cyber which the Pakistanis are currently engaged in. And I think there is a quiet confidence that they'll be able to handle the impact of whatever happens in Afghanistan, partly because, and this is no secret, this is something which has been stated publicly, and that is one thing which I take seriously coming from Pakistan, when they say that they actually want Afghanistan to be peaceful and friendly. Now, again, you could turn around and say that they could have wanted it. If they wanted that, then why did they sponsor the Taliban? But they wanted to be peaceful and friendly under the Taliban, right? Because it won't be friendly otherwise. And they think it will be friendly only if the Taliban are in control. So, and this is where I stop buying the bullshit which the Pakistanis sell, which is that we don't want the Taliban in power. They want the Taliban in power, and they will do everything to ensure that the Taliban get the power and control Afghanistan, because they want a peaceful Afghanistan under the Taliban, because they think that such a state will serve Pakistan's purpose. And all those grand schemes which they have of, getting access to Central Asia and all of those things, connectivity and all of that, will come through if Afghanistan is pacified and under a friendly regime. On the other hand, if that does not happen, then the shit hits the fan. Okay. So whether we like it or not, and whatever the Pakistanis might say, fact of the matter is they will double down in their support for these guys, for the Taliban. And chances are that this doubling down will mean that they will intervene in Afghanistan, probably covertly, to help the Taliban gain ascendancy and actually capture Afghanistan. And the thing is that if they don't help the Taliban will be angry. But if they do help the Taliban and actually start intervening directly in Afghanistan, even if surreptitiously, they will get sucked in and enmeshed in Afghanistan. So, since we are talking about implosion and how it's likely to come about, this is the trajectory. Because whatever else anybody might say, Afghanistan is a very treacherous terrain, and nobody has really emerged unscathed by entering it and interfering out there. I don't see how the Pakistanis will also not get impacted. Uh, Now, the one thing, and even in Pakistan, there are some sensible people. Uh, and among some of those sensible people, the one thing I would agree with is that when they say that a Taliban takeover in Afghanistan will make Afghanistan a magnet for Islamist groups from all over the world. If you thought ISIS was something great, wait and see what happens in Afghanistan. Uh, so, and this will happen regardless of whether the Taliban take over or there is a civil war. I don't think the civil war will be for very long. I might be wrong. But given the current performance of the Afghan National Army and the spate of surrenders, I don't see much of a resistance to the Taliban going forward. And I think the Taliban will take over. But assuming that there is a civil war, even then, there will be Islamists from all over the world who will make a beeline to help the Taliban establish their emirate. Now, the thing is that it will not only be the Islamists from all over the world, it will also be Islamists from and that will have a kind of a blowback impact on Pakistan also, which is something which some sensible people in Pakistan are actually afraid of. Now, the other thing is that the fact that the Pakistanis have their people embedded with the Taliban, ex-servicemen, some current servicemen, jihadist groups, jihadist auxiliaries, all of them who have been working with in conjunction with the Taliban, means that if things don't go well in Afghanistan, there will be a kind of a reaction against Pakistan, which will again, once again, spill over. So this is as far as this Afghanistan thing is concerned. And the other thing which is really of serious concern to the Pakistanis is the impact of Afghanistan on their own Pashtun areas where there is a lot of restiveness. So I think this factor will be very critical. Along with it, the US attitude towards Pakistan will be something which remains to be seen. The US has been a kind of a very reluctant power as far as Pakistan is concerned. And in fact, it's been my view that the Americans probably do not realize their own power, much less how to exercise it when it comes to Pakistan. They mollycoddled Pakistan hell of a lot. And I'm myself not sure if the US will take any hard measures against Pakistan going forward. Pakistanis fear that the US might dump the entire blame for whatever has happened in Afghanistan on the Pakistanis, but they might do that. But I don't see them imposing Iran-type sanctions on the Pakistanis anytime soon. And in fact, the reason for that is what I said earlier. Many Americans see Pakistan as a country which is too dangerous to fail because of nuclear weapons and other things. And the Pakistanis encourage this kind of thinking among the Americans. What the Pakistanis are now doing, because they think something the Americans will do, but they don't think they'll go whole hog. So what they are now doing is what they earlier used to call strategic defiance. And in Afghanistan, this strategic defiance will take the role of not helping the Americans, backing the Taliban, all of that. And they will do this because, they have latched on to an old statement of Joe Biden when he was the vice president, when he had told a visiting Afghan president, I think it was Karzai, that listen, Pakistan is 50 times more important for us than Afghanistan is. So understand that. So the Pakistanis think that if Pakistan is so important, now that the Americans are leaving Afghanistan, Afghanistan has absolutely no importance for them. So they won't screw around with us too much. I think that's the thinking, and that is why this strategic defiance will come in. But the Pakistanis also need the Americans, because with the Americans, they get access to international financial markets, they get finances, they get market access, and their kids can travel and settle in America or Britain or Australia. No self-respecting general of the Pakistan army will ever send his kids to China, right? China is an all-weather friend, iron brother and all of that. But listen, for God's sake, kids can't go and settle in China. They have to go to England, or they have to go to America, or they have to go to one of these civilized countries, not China. So they need the Americans and the West. Now, it's been my belief that if the Americans want, they can actually bring Pakistan down to its knees within a matter of weeks, if not earlier. Pakistan is not Iran. They don't have that kind of staying power. They don't even have that oil. Okay, and they have too many strategic problems, because when the Americans crack down, then it's not just the Americans cracking down. Europe comes with it. The Saudis and the rest of the Arab countries come with it. All sorts of other things follow. So I don't think the Pakistanis can resist the Americans if they actually start cracking down the way they have done on Russia or Iran or some of the other countries. So one is that American angle. The second is for Pakistanis, the Saudis and the other Arab countries, especially the UAE, are the two most critical countries in the Middle East. But what they have done is that they've been sucking up to Turkey, because Imran Khan loves that drama serial called Ertugrul, and he actually thinks it's real history. Frankly, I don't know why people send their children to Oxford University. Not only have we seen the case of Rashmi Samant, but even Imran Khan is a bad advertisement for Oxford University. Frankly, but he actually believes that Ertugrul, a serial from Turkey, is actual history. And he's really impressed with the Turks. And this has really pissed off the Saudis. So there is that tension which is already there. Then there is the Iran factor, and the Saudis are not, very kind to anybody who, especially in the Muslim world, who looks towards Iran. And one of Pakistan's wet dreams is that there'll be a new strategic alignment of what I call the BRICS, Pakistan, Russia, Iran, China. And the pun on the word BRICS is completely intended, but so they are looking for that kind of an alliance, and that certainly is not going to go down well with the Saudis. For now, this issue has been papered over, but I think this is going to crop up going forward. And like I said, any perceived closeness to Iran is a no-go area as far as the Arabs are concerned. The Saudi-Iranian tussle also has its impact on Pakistan in terms of the sectarian conflict in that country. It has been contained for the last couple of years, but it can erupt anytime. And the Taliban factor in Afghanistan will also add fuel to fire. If there are sectarian pogroms or massacres in Afghanistan, then Iran will jump in. Iran has already formed these militias to act out there. Some of those militias are made of Pakistanis. Some of them are of Afghans. So clearly this thing will spiral out of control. And the sectarian tension has serious repercussions for Pakistan. Along with it, the ethnic issues are likely to flare up, because whatever happens in Afghanistan, if refugees start streaming in, maybe a million or more. The Pashtun belt in Pakistan, which is already very restive, could suddenly explode. And in fact, there could even be a kind of a civil war within the Pashtun areas inside Pakistan between the anti-Taliban forces represented by the PTM and the Taliban, who have at least some degree of support from the Pakistani state. So there is that problem which is likely to grow. In Balochistan, they've never been able to solve the problem. And that problem has gone nowhere. Uh, there's an ebb and flow in that problem, but it's still there. Sindh, you can sense some murmurs right now, nothing out of the ordinary, but yeah, there are some murmurs which are starting of Sindhi nationalists. And in Punjab, there has been a palpable sentiment against the army because of the way they've dealt with people like Nawaz Sharif. Now, when you start adding all this up, suddenly, if the Chinese are looking at Pakistan as an investment destination, they become skittish. And if investment is not going to come, how does the economy recover? And if the economy does not recover and economic distress continues to grow, then you have a serious crisis on your hand. Especially if the West also starts, uh, doesn't behave the way you want it to behave, but behaves differently. So these are mounting problems. On the politics, frankly speaking, there's nothing much to say. I think we've all tend to take politicians on face value, both in India as well as in Pakistan. I think that's the most silly thing anybody can do in retrospect. And in Pakistani politics, the more somebody is bombastic, especially like Nawaz Sharif and company and all of these guys, the more they are ready to compromise. That bombast is basically a kind of a dance which they are doing in front of the army to attract them and say that please look at us also. We are also there to service you. So don't ignore us. And I think it's all for the attention of the army. So basically, as far as domestic politics of the conventional type is concerned, I think all the politicians in Pakistan are not worth anything to anybody. And in some ways, they're all subservient to the army, and Pakistan has become quite depoliticized, which is not a good thing because until and unless you have a vibrant polity, which is not just dependent on the Americans, you have a serious, on the army, you have a very serious problem on your hands. And finally, you have the two blind spots of Pakistan, uh, both eyes, which is ironical because eyes tend not to have blind spot, but um, India is one eye and Islam is the other eye. Both of them are blind spots for the Pakistanis. And as far as as far as Islam is concerned, there is of course a resurgence going to take place with Taliban. You already have another group. You had mentioned it earlier, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik, which is there, which has now emerged as the largest religious political party in Pakistan, has a grassroots level support, has very passionate supporters. So you have the TLP, which is emerging. It's been bottled up for now, but it can erupt anytime. And you have a host of other Islamist groups, all of which are likely to be enthused by the success of the Taliban in Afghanistan, like Islamist groups around the world are likely to be. Uh, so that is one, and this Islamic factor is going to then, you know, interfere in their ability to reform, their ability to reach out, on a range of other things. On the India factor, I think nothing needs to be really said. Unless we are deluding ourselves, we are the eternal enemy of the Pakistanis. And we fool ourselves when we tend to take the Pakistanis on face value. Now, clearly, the Indian media often plays a very dubious role in forwarding the kind of Pakistani line uh, or as somebody once called it, pleasant lies that the Pakistani tell us. And, I can't understand this breathless excitement which people have. Oh, Mr. Doval is going to such and such place. Even the Pakistani will come out there. Just excited for no reason at all. Mr. Doval had no intention of meeting that guy. But, just start floating these things. Um, so this breathless excitement and then, trying to create some kind of a noise around it. Um, I can't understand this. But nevertheless, there is really no change on the ground level vis-a-vis India. Some tactical pauses are there, but that's about it. And all these stories of a new thaw coming and all is utter nonsense. The setback which has been dealt to them in Kashmir has really stunned them. And I don't think they even know what hit them. They simply can't understand why, against all predictions that Kashmir will explode, etc., there is nothing happening out there. And it's kind of really quiet. And I think Mr. Modi is now looking to restart a kind of a political process out there, which is a good thing because you cannot have a political void or a vacuum for any length of time. That can backfire. But I think that's taken the Pakistanis by a bit of surprise. But I suspect that they will not see this as something they can use to reform as far as India is concerned. I suspect that they will continue to use jihad against India. There is already, but the nature of the jihad will change. I think the pressure of the FATF and of other international bodies which are looking at Pakistan very closely prevent them from openly supporting terrorism the way they did it in the 1990s and even the 2000s. I don't think that's possible anymore. But nevertheless, I think the terrorists continue to be active and their recruitment is continuing, their training is continuing, and they're continuing to even raise funds despite FATF and all of that. So somewhere along the line, the Pakistanis will have to start using these jihadis against India. Because if they don't, then these guys are going to turn their guns inwards. So that again, so now just start joining all the dots which I've pointed out, the economy, what is happening in Afghanistan, the Islamic resurgence, the terrorists that the Pakistanis have been sponsoring. The interplay of all of this could very easily lead to a situation where, something gives. And I don't know if I've used this analogy earlier with you, but somebody whom I used to consider to be my guru, who passed away unfortunately during this COVID crisis, had given me an analogy which fits Pakistan very well and probably answers your question on the implosion of Pakistan. He said, look, it's like a brick wall. And in a brick wall, you can knock out a brick, the wall will keep standing. You can keep randomly knocking out bricks, the wall will not fall, the wall will be standing. But there will come that one brick, and you don't know which that brick is. There will be that one brick that once you knock it out, the entire edifice collapses. And I suspect that that is the trajectory it's going to be. I don't know what that one brick is going to be, but I've just told you all the bricks which are being taken out at regular intervals. So when that final brick comes, I don't know, and I'll rest out here.
Thank you, Sushantji, for that wonderful, exposition of Pakistan and its internal dynamics. Friends, Sushantji has to leave early, so if you have any questions, kindly post it into my chat, and then I will ask him. In the meanwhile, I will have a couple of questions to ask him, and so please direct your questions to me. Sushantji, let's look at Indian response to what is happening in Pakistan. When Pakistan gets involved in almost everything which is quote unquote Muslim in India, whereas India does not respond to things that are happening to, let us say, the Pakistani Hindus, for instance, or the Balochis. Prime Minister Modi made an announcement or made a statement on the ramparts of Red Fort about the Baluchis, but then nothing happened after that. Brahmada Bukti doesn't get a visa for India, whatever. So why is India behaving like this? Why don't we do uh, things in Pakistan which are going to hurt them or which are going to make them change their behavior?
Honestly, I don't know. And, I think we should raise hell. We should bring all possible, power that we have as a country to raise hell over the treatment of minorities, not just the Hindus, Christians. But look, you have to look at your fifth column within your own country. You reached out to the Hindus. I don't agree with the CAA bill, not because of the what other people were saying, but my objection to the CAA bill is that it should have been open-ended. That people who are religious minorities who are facing persecution in Pakistan, why do you have a cutoff date of what 2015 or whatever? You mean to say after
Right.
2015 religious persecution is not happening? That little girls,
True.
12-year, 13-year-old girls are not being raped and forcibly converted? And the Pakistani judiciary is so shameless that they actually throw those girls back to their abductors and nobody
True.
talks about it. And none of these Indian so-called human rights organizations, which were getting their knickers in a twist over what happened in Kashmir a few days back, ever bother about what happens to religious minorities in Pakistan. They never open. They will talk about what happens to blacks in America. They will talk about what happens to somebody else somewhere else. But when it comes to Hindus, Christians, Sikhs in these countries, there's never any word. But our government also has a similar attitude. I don't know why. And I'm of the view that uh, I think this is a matter we should constantly raise hell on. Why we don't do it? You probably know more people in the government than I do. You might like to ask them.
Okay. And the second thing is a lot of talk about POJK and Gilgit Baltistan. Amit Shah made a emotional statement on the floor of Parliament that we'll give our lives to take it back. Do you see that happening anytime soon? Do you see the Indian establishment even seriously thinking about it? At least to my knowledge, I have not seen any movement, but maybe you know something better. What's your view on that? Would India ever want to take it back? Will it take it back, and would it want to take it back? Um, do you see how do you see this?
Look, the official position is, of course, that we will take it back. The official position is also that we will not do anything in a haste to take it back. It's not that we're going to, wage war to take it back, but we will wait for an opportune time, and countries can wait 50 years, 100 years to reclaim territory which they believe is theirs. So that is what the government position is. I don't take these kind of emotional outbursts seriously, uh, except to the extent that when politicians make these kind of statements, to the extent that it focuses attention on an issue which had earlier been pushed into the background and nobody was even talking about it, uh, and was just being mentioned in a very pro forma kind of a way to state a formal stand. When a politician talks about it that passionately, even though nothing might actually be happening on the ground, and there is no immediate thing to suggest that there will be some action being taken, uh, although the Pakistanis seem to think that we are preparing for it, and that's good that they are thinking like that. But I myself am not aware whether there is some thing like that in the offing. But the fact that senior people in government flag the issue, talk about it, keep agitating it, keep it on the agenda, I think is important. If you actually consider it to be a part of your territory. For a variety of reasons, you might not be able to go ahead and make it a part of your country right now, make it rejoin your own country. But why should you foreclose that option? So I think it's good that we keep talking about it. Should we do it? Why not? If we say that it's a part of our country, then why not? I can understand, some people will say, but listen, it's 100% Muslim majority area, it will create more problems for us. Look, if we can live with 200 million Muslims in India, why can't we live with 20 million more Muslims in a territory which we call our own? The 200 million Muslims in India are Indian citizens. They have all the rights that you and I have, right? There'll be problems between various communities, various people, all of that. Which country in the world does not have those problems? We keep looking at India and talking about it. The Americans don't have these kind of problems. The Australians don't, the Chinese don't, the Russians don't. Which country in the world has which absolutely, the land of milk and honey for everybody? So we also have our problem. As a nation, we are a work in progress. It took the Americans 300 years, 250 years to reach where they've reached. So I think we call something our own, then we must work towards getting it back, even though we might not take any knee-jerk reaction to have any knee-jerk reaction to get it back.
What about the after effects? Let us for a minute assume that Pakistan implodes. If it implodes, what should India be doing? Would we want, let us say, Sindh to be part of Indian territory, or do we want to take over some parts which are already radicalized in the Punjab part of it? Should it implode? What do we do? Or let's say we extend Article 370 to Sindh, give it, we hold the defense and other aspects, and then give some kind of a self-autonomy. How do you see India playing a role in an imploded Pakistan?
Look, I don't know. I'll be very honest with you. My fear is that we will not have the capacity and the capability of dealing with it. It's not a small problem, it's a country of 210, 220 million people. It's not easy to handle a problem like that. If you think you can fence yourself, and save yourself, that fence is good for 200 people, 500 people, 5,000 people. It's not good if there are a million people on your borders. That fence can't hold them back, right? I wish there was instead of Arabian Sea, there was a Sea of Pakistan or something, and problem is sorted out, but that's not likely to happen, right? And frankly, I have no answer, but I simply don't agree with anybody who says, I don't subscribe to this Akhand Bharat concept. Nation states have to, don't keep changing their borders like this. If Pakistan implodes, if there is Sindh, we should have fraternal relations, and Sindh becomes an independent country. India can have fraternal relations with Sindh. Why not? For example, we have very good relations with the Afghans, at least the current Afghan dispensation. Very friendly, very brotherly relations with them. If we've opened our homes and hearts through the Afghans, we can do something similar with, say, Balochistan, with Sindh, even Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The one people I wouldn't want to touch with a 10-foot barge pole are the Punjabis. I think they are the most pernicious and vicious and poisonous people. So ignore them.
You're a Punjabi.
Yeah, of course I'm a Punjabi. No, no.
Yeah, Punjabi
I happen to be. I'm a Punjabi. I'm very proud of belonging to Punjab. But at the end of the day, I'm also an Indian. I look at what India's interests will be served by. So I don't have any other this thing. So my own sense is that the Punjabi Pakistani is the you know is the worst kind of person you can ever meet. He lies. He is treacherous. Uh, he lies to your face, and I wouldn't trust him on anything. I wouldn't say the same for the Sindhi, for the Baloch, or the Pashtun. But that's me. That's
Well, it's just that people like you and the think tanks in this country will have to start wargaming, this scenario. It may happen 10 years, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, whenever it happens. We probably should start having some kind of wargaming about this and, keep some options which float in the public discussion. That's what I feel so. So just parking it for your thought. So maybe you should write something on that as well. I think we'll close it with just one or two questions. If how do we do to weaken Pakistan to a level that it will not be a nuisance to us? Is there a way that we can do something to make them be a less of a nuisance to us? Is it possible?
it's a very simple answer. How do you make if you are given a line? How do you make that line smaller or bigger? You draw another line next to it. Basically, to paraphrase that, the best way to weaken Pakistan is to strengthen yourself. As simple as that. Let your economy grow by 8, 9%, 10% every year on year. Uh, Encourage quality education, not the nonsense we are doing right now. That you have one or two centers of excellence and everything else is just you're churning out unemployable people. Make sure that your people, and they're very bright people, but make sure that they're put through the paces. They are given good quality education so that you have scientists, you have businessmen, you have all sorts of people out here, right? You are innovating. Your industry is growing. Uh, your national power is increasing. You're not dependent on others for technology. Some of it, of course, will come from abroad, but a lot of it you manufacture out here. A lot of it you innovate out here. Strengthen India, and then that is the best defense you have and the best weapon you have to weaken your opponents. Look, whether we like China or not, the fact of the matter is that's what the Chinese have done. And that's the only way forward. You can't be trying to weaken Pakistan while not strengthening yourself. That's a mug's game.
Yeah, fine. I think I'll ask a last question and we'll close the session, Sushanti. Now there is a talk about elections being held in POJK and Gilgit-Baltistan. Officially, these they don't even form part of Pakistan as per their own constitution. So, do you see moves by Pakistan to annex these things officially, legally, incorporate into their constitution anytime soon, so that China can have an international clean check to do their CPEC or whatever? Are you seeing those signs of annexation?
No, I think they are in a bit of a quandary. Not so much on the Mirpur Muzaffarabad part of POJK, or what they euphemistically call Azad Jammu Kashmir. Not that tiny sliver of land. I think that they want to maintain the fiction that this is an independent area and all of that nonsense. I think they are looking at the more strategic part, which is Gilgit-Baltistan, and they're in a bit of a quandary whether they should make it a provisional province, because they think that way they'll be able to give it all provincial rights and yet keep the door open for the final settlement in their view. Final settlement to India ke paas hi aayega wo, but the Pakistanis think that there'll be a final settlement in which Kashmir will be settled and they'll get something. So I think there is that quandary out there, because there are some people who feel that if they do something like this, it will spoil Pakistan's case. Not that they have much of a case, but it'll spoil Pakistan's case in the international community. There are others who feel that no, this provisional kind of a thing will be able to give them a wriggle room to manage it. So I think there's a bit of a quandary on that count. I don't know which way they're going to decide. We will, of course, not accept it. We will, of course, oppose it. We will reject it. All of that. So in that sense, in a manner of speaking, the status quo will stay. The Pakistanis will, of course, not do the same thing with, like I call it, the Mirpur Muzaffarabad belt. But they, because they also need to maintain that fiction. But on Gilgit-Baltistan, because of its strategic value, and that's the only area which has strategic value for the Pakistanis, apart from Balochistan. So I suspect that they will try some stunt like that in that area. But what could hold them back is that it might just backfire legally and as far as the international community is concerned. And if it backfires to the point where the world starts saying that, okay, fine, yeah, you guys have taken this, the Indians have that, then might as well just settle now on whatever is the status quo. Not that we are going to agree to it, but the Pakistanis feel that if the world starts talking on those terms, then there could be problems for the Pakistanis. So I think that's where matters are.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sushant-ji. You just bear with us for a minute or so. We propose a formal vote of thanks. Chandrasekhar-ji will propose it. And friends, before we close the session for day, I just wanted to inform you that next Saturday at 6 p.m., we're going to have Professor R. Vaidyanathan, who's going to talk on judicial reforms, a crying need. Our judiciary is still steeped in colonial hangover. We need to reform that, and he's going to give a talk on that. So kindly, please join in on that date. I now hand it over to my colleague Chandrasekhar ji to propose a quick vote of thanks. I know Sushant ji has to leave, but that's a formality. We love to do it.
Sure. Thanks, Girdhar ji. Thanks for the opportunity. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks at this wonderful session. A very good evening to Sushant ji. We always watch and hear you on the television, but today it's an opportunity for all of us to interact with you on our dais. Of course, you were here before. Thanks once again. You've clearly proposed your clear analysis. And in that, you actually mentioned Pakistan's attitude, intent, and their worries. And you also mentioned the possible stances of Islamic countries, China, and US as well. Very rightly, you have mentioned USA can show its place to Pakistan if they want to, truly. And you also mentioned about the blind spots for Pakistan, which are one, India, and the other one, Islam. And interestingly, your point, like Pakistan has to use those jihadis somewhere, else the guns will be turning inwards, truly. And finally, the analogy you have used from that, like you mentioned, we'll have to wait and see which is that final brick going to be. A wonderful analysis, Sushant-ji, once again. Thanks for coming to our dais and speaking to all of us. It gave us so much, we have been enriched so much, I would say. When time permits, please, we'd like to welcome you once again. Thanks so much. A very good evening.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you,
Jai Hind and one. Thank you, Sushant-ji. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Namaste and Jai Hind. Bharat Mata ki Jai.
Jai Hind.